Chapter 9 of Mary's Grammar by Jane MARCET. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jennifer Dallman. Interjections. This part of speech can hardly be called words, for it consists of exclamations or cries uttered by a person who admires or is surprised or frightened, such as, "Oh! Ah! Alas! Oh dear me!" They are very easy to find out, for they are always written with a line and a dot after them. Interjections amused Mary extremely. She remembered an old nurse who used to sigh and say, "Hi ho!" and "Alack and a well day," and asked whether those were interjections. Her mother told her they were. "But, Mamma," said Mary, "nurse used to say so very often without admiring anything, or being surprised or frightened." "Very aged people," said her mother, "are apt to use exclamations of that sort from a feeling of weariness without thinking. And I know some very young people, Mary, who acquire the same habit from the vivacity and impatience of youth. But then their exclamations are shorter. Did you never hear a little girl say, 'Oh, yes,' and 'Oh, dear, no,' when a simple yes or no would have done as well?" "Perhaps they would," said Mary, "but I like much better saying 'Oh' and 'Ah.'" And she skipped about the room repeating every interjection she could recollect. And when out of breath, she sat down saying, "Well, I shall never forget interjections. They are so funny." "But Mary," said her mother, "you should add something to your interjections, to express what it is that frightens or delights you." "I am neither frightened nor delighted, Mamma. It is only make-believe." "Then make believe to be frightened or delighted with something." Mary thought a little, and then said, "Oh, I am afraid of that horse which is galloping so fast will run over me." "And now for an exclamation of pleasure," said her mother. "You are going to tell me a long story tomorrow, Mamma. Ah, how glad I shall be! And when you have heard it, I hope that you will use an interjection of admiration." "Oh, yes," replied Mary. "You may be sure that I shall say, 'Oh, dear, how pretty it is!' Well, I see that we must come to the story at last." And the next day she read as follows: The Crust of Bread, a Fairy Tale. Edward, a little boy, 6 years old, was one day strolling about the garden eating a large crust of bread. He threw himself on the grass and lay idly basking in the sun without thinking of anything. All at once there appeared before him a beautiful fairy, whose name was Instruction. Her dress shone with the brilliant colors of the rainbow, and she wore a crown of flowers on her head. In one hand she held a silver wand, with which she could perform wonderful things, and in the other a book, the leaves of which were all made of looking-glass, and which was no less wonderful than the wand. She smiled and looked so good-humouredly on Edward that instead of being frightened, he was quite pleased. She then opened and showed him her book. In the first page he saw himself, and everything around him reflected as you do in a common looking-glass. But the other pages were of a much more extraordinary nature, for they reflected objects which were quite out of sight, and even in the most remote parts of the world. In one page he beheld lions and tigers in Africa, roaming about in search of prey. Edward shrunk back, half frightened at seeing them move and look alive, but the fairy explained to him that it was only a representation of a wild beast, just as his face was represented on the first page, so that there was really nothing to fear. She then turned over another leaf, and Edward saw a large elephant in India tearing up a young tree by the roots with his trunk. In another page she showed him the monkeys climbing up the trees in the woods in America, and hanging by their tails to the branches, gibbering and pelting each other with nuts, while the parrots, with their gaudy plumage, flew about as common as sparrows do here. The fairy now closed her book. Edward begged of her to show him a few more of the looking-glass leaves, and declared that he had never seen any picture book that could be compared to this. But the fairy said that there were so many children wanting to see it that she could not stay with him any longer. "Oh dear!" cried Edward, "what shall I do when you are gone, and nothing to amuse me?" "You seemed very well amused before I came," said the fairy, "lounging as you were on the grass and eating your crust of bread." "So I was," replied Edward, "but since you have shown me that pretty book, I shall do nothing but long to see it again. I don't care for my crust of bread any longer." "Well," said the fairy, "I will make you care for your bread again. I will give the bread the power of speaking, and it shall tell you its history from beginning to end. Will that not amuse you?" "Yes, indeed it would," replied Edward. "It would be so strange to hear the crust of bread speak." "Take care to hold it to your ear and not to your mouth," said the fairy, smiling. "For were you thoughtlessly to give it a bite whilst it was speaking, it would tell you no more." Then she waved her wand over the bread and disappeared. When she was gone, Edward began to think she must have been joking. However, he took up the bread and held it to his ear. He started back with surprise when he heard a small, gentle voice speak as follows: "The first thing I can remember was when I was only a grain of corn, lying in a large room with a great many other grains. We remained there a long time, when one day a man came and took out a quantity of us. He put us into a sack and carried us away. Soon after he took us to a field that had just been plowed, and there he took us out of the sack and strewed us in handful on the ground." "That was sowing corn," said Edward. "I shall never forget," continued the bread, "how sweet and fresh the newly plowed earth smelt, and how much I enjoyed lying there with the warm sunbeams shining on me. Soon after there came by a flight of crows, and the laborers being away, they alighted on the ground and began picking up all the grains of corn within their reach. I lay trembling with alarm, thinking my turn would come, and that I should be devoured. But before they reached the spot where I was, the laborers returned to the field and drove them away. Soon after there was a shower of rain, and some of the drops fell upon me and carried me down with them into the ground, where I was quite safe from the birds. There I remained some time, but I found that I began to swell and grow so large that at last my skin could not hold me, so it burst open, and out there came at one end a little tuft of small roots, scarcely larger than hairs. These stuck in the ground and grew downwards. At the other end out came a tiny green stalk, which soon grew above the ground. At first it looked like a small blade of grass, but it grew taller and taller, and stronger, and at last a beautiful ear of corn was seen at the top of this stalk, and a few long leaves, like those of grass, grew on the stalk. Thus from a small seed of corn I was changed into a little plant, and a very pretty change it was. The little roots sucked in water, which went up all through my green veins into the ear, and made it swell out and grow large and full of seeds. Then, when the hot weather came, the sun turned me yellow as gold, and the wind blew me about with the other ears of corn that grew in the field beside me, and I assure you we all felt very proud of our grace and beauty. But our pride did not last long, for one day a number of men came into the field with sickles and cut us down." "Those were the reapers," said Edward. "We were then bound up in sheaves and set upright on the ground, leaning one against the other for support. For, being separated from our roots in the ground, we were no longer able to stand upright. We remained all night on the ground, and the next day we were put into a large cart and carried to a barn. There we were stowed for some time and left quiet, excepting that a frightful rat now and then found its way into the barn, and made great havoc amongst us, devouring as many of us as he could swallow for his breakfast. After some time a number of men came again and pulled us down, and spreading us upon the floor of the barn, began beating us most unmercifully." "Those were the thrashers," said Edward. "It was well for you that you could not feel, for those double sticks they used, called flails, give very hard blows." "It was indeed," replied the crust of bread. "Well, these hard blows drove us out of all the ears in which we grew. The stalks, which were then nothing but straw, were taken away, but the grains of corn with the chaff were put into a large flat basket and shaken about until the chaff was all blown away, and nothing but the grains remained." "So then you were changed back into a grain of corn," said Edward. "Not into one grain," replied the bread, "but into 20 or 30. I was but a single grain, it is true, when I was first sown in the ground, but I sprang up with so fine an ear that I do believe I had nearly 30 seeds. No others were so plump and well grown as myself. Well, the next thing that happened to me was being sent to the mill to be ground all to pieces to make flour, and after that to the baker, who mixed me up with water and yeast and made me into a piece of dough, and after I had been well kneaded, he put me into an oven to bake. I thus became part of a loaf of bread, which the baker's boy brought here today to be eaten. At the last word the voice failed. The power of the fairy's wand was at an end. Edward waited for some time to listen whether the bread would say any more, and finding it quite silent, he took it from his ear, put it to his mouth, and ate it up. End of chapter 9.